of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Correa, both of you for your very kind words. My passing from this place doesn't hold a candle to the seriousness of the subject that is before us today. And so I very much appreciate your comments, but I want to get to the matter at hand. And I do want to say to Mr. Correa, I have such a fond feeling for you, sir, and it is important to say that we do have very fundamental disagreements, and yet you are a warm-hearted, kind individual. And I wish that it were possible for us to express just how deeply our differences are felt without it appearing sometimes that we dislike each other on a personal basis. I do not. I haven't disliked anybody in this Congress. Well, I'm sure there's probably an exception or two to that. But for the most part, it is merely the seriousness of the problems that we confront and the deep disagreements about what leads to them that I think leads me to the things I'm going to say right now. When you say that we need more resources for rescuing children from these circumstances, when we say that we need more resources to crack down on employers who would employ vulnerable children in the country, when you say you need more resources to ferret out and child sex trafficking and the most horrendous sorts of victimization that you can imagine, sheer hell on earth. I don't know how you can talk about that need without reckoning with whether or not decisions that each of us made gave rise to the need that is articulated. Why did the people come? Because it was declared that the border was open. Let's face it, that's what was declared. That's why you saw a sudden, dramatic change. You saw a massive, complete 180-degree reversal of policy that had attenuated the flow most successfully in history. It was 100% reversed. And so we see the horrific circumstances that you now want to articulate more burdens on the American taxpayer to attempt to solve. You want to impose more burdens on the men and women of law enforcement who are already overburdened with the problems we have in society in the United States that will now be increasingly neglected because you have chosen to recreate in the United States to a substantial degree the horrific circumstances that are causing people to flee elsewhere. I too want to thank our witnesses for joining us today to examine this tragic crisis enabled by one of the major parties in politics in the American political system, and the Biden-Harris administration's gross mismanagement of caring for unaccompanied migrant children. And I think it also bears noting at the beginning, what we're examining here today are the unaccompanied children who went into the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and were supposedly cared for to the best of the capability of the overtaxed resources of the United States of America. And it overlooks every other migrant child who came in, many of them purportedly with family units to which they may not have been genuinely attached. And what has happened to them? We won't even see that in the numbers, upwards of 100,000 that we say have gone missing. We don't even know, those people aren't even represented in those stats. So under the Biden administration, over 526,000 unaccompanied alien children crossed the southwest border. Unprecedented number. Each year, from 2021 to 2023, CBP encountered over 130,000 unaccompanied children, more than twice the levels seen under the Obama and Trump administrations. While CBP is usually the first point of contact for unaccompanied children who cross the border, the Health and Human Services Department's Office of Refugee Resettlement is primarily responsible for the care and placement of these children. Much of this work is done in partnership with non-governmental organizations that provide shelter and services, usually under contract. Under the Biden-Harris administration, these NGOs received a windfall of taxpayer money through ORR, whose budget for its unaccompanied children program was $6.9 billion in fiscal year 2023. We throw these terms around, these numbers up here, like they don't matter. $6.9 billion, and my good friend and colleague in California is up here talking about we got to get a lot more. We need a lot more. Southwest Key Programs, the largest housing provider of unaccompanied children, one contractor, received more than $2.5 billion in taxpayer funding over the past 3 years. This summer, the federal government sued Southwest Key, alleging that employees engaged in a pattern of sexual abuse and harassment against children in its shelters and failed to take sufficient action to protect the children in its care. Do you see how the dominoes fall? This is what happens when you begin with one ill-considered, ideologically bound decision that did not take account of the realities on the ground or the circumstances that would certainly ensue, and they have ensued. Another company, Deployed Resources, has had a contract for a migrant facility in Greensboro, North Carolina, my state, since May 2022. $39.5 million has already been spent, with another $64 million obligated, but incredibly, according to HHS, no children have been in care at the facility from the time it became operational in March until it went into standby in June. Do you see how the consequences proliferate of unbelievably bad decision-making? What do we spend all that money on? The Biden-Harris administration placed political aims above the welfare of unaccompanied migrant children who crossed or were trafficked across the southern border, releasing UACs, I'm not going to use that term, releasing unaccompanied children with inadequate vetting and follow-up to avoid the bad optics of crowded facilities. The Office of Refugee Resettlement releases children to sponsors in the United States. Thorough vetting of these sponsors is absolutely critical and morally compelled if that's the path you're going to undertake to bring these children across. Unfortunately, the Biden-Harris administration's push to bring in migrants, to quickly release migrants, resulted in countless cases of migrant children being released to sponsors with major red flags, placing children at obvious risk of exploitation that has played out in exactly the exploitation that would have been anticipated. Far too often, children are released to sponsors who do not care about their welfare and intend to exploit the child through, at a minimum, child labor, and very often far more heinous forms of trafficking. Is it really in the interest of these children to rush to release them to individuals who are trying to sponsor multiple unrelated migrant children? This is a systemic failure that has put thousands of vulnerable children in risky situations here in the United States. This failure goes well beyond the vetting issues on the front end. As an Inspector General report earlier this year made clear, that the federal government cannot account for tens of thousands of children that HHS released to sponsors. 32,000 children didn't show up for their immigration court hearings. Those hearing dates are one of the only opportunities that ICE must engage with unaccompanied children and observe signs of trafficking or exploitation. What happened to those? What happened not just to 32,000, each one of them? What happened to that child? We do not know. They cannot be reached. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Over 290,000 have been released by HHS without a notice to appear for an immigration court date at all. So there will be no such opportunity to observe signs of trafficking or exploitation. There's no way for ICE to monitor their location, the status of these children, or verify their safety. We've asked and even subpoenaed HHS for information about the screening of potential sponsors and the children that they've lost contact with. In many cases, documented by investigative journalists with the New York Times, children released to sponsors who may not even be related to the child ended up working dangerous jobs to pay off debts or send money back home, often working night shifts or dropping out of school. Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record 3 articles. Alone and exploited migrant children work brutal jobs across the United States. That's February 28, 2023. Second one, as migrant children were put to work, U.S. ignored warnings, April 17, 2023, New York Times. And finally, U.S. failed to safeguard many migrant children, review finds.
Without objection.
16, 2024. The federal government has precipitated and is facilitating this humanitarian catastrophe. The unaccompanied children are released from the HHS shelters right into the hands of these sponsors, despite multiple warnings from staffers within the agency that the vetting process was failing to protect children. The Biden administration was so focused on moving people through the system as fast as possible that they failed to ensure the safety of the children they were releasing. Many of these children already suffered at the hands of criminal cartels on that treacherous journey to the border, only to find themselves exploited again after leaving government custody. The human cost of this impossible to understand bad judgment is simply heartbreaking and tragic. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses as we shine a light on this monumental failure. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.